You have to learn how to sing. You learn your parts. You don't steal other people's parts. You learn how to sing it. You learn to feel how it feels when it's correct. So even if you can't hear it, you know that it's correct. And I would like to be a better singer that way. So we'll see.
Turn your speakers up to 11 because it's time for Too Much Effing Perspective, the podcast that asks musicians and entertainers to relive their most Spinal Tap moments when nothing goes right and everything gets kind of weird. I'm your host, Alan Keller, a comedy writer in LA and former lead singer of the least heralded Chicago band, The Falling Wallendas.
And I'm your co-host, Alex Hoffman, former tour manager for Radiohead and The Chills from New Zealand. I was also former lead singer of the least heralded Milwaukee band, The Vainglorious.
Our guest today is from the influential 80s band, the dB's, as well as having played extensively with REM and Darius Rucker, musician Peter Holsapple.
Peter tells us about the time he was left behind at a gas station during a Hootie and the Blowfish tour, how he bugged the crap out of big stars Alex Chilton, and what it was like to play with REM when they were the biggest band in the world.
So without further ado, let's go to the TMEP show.
It really puts perspective on things, doesn't it?
Not too much. There's too much
yeah.
effing perspective now.
Alex, when I was about 3, my parents gave me a plastic watering can so I could mimic them while they were planting flowers in our garden. But what was really cool about it was that they would stick plastic flowers in the soil where I had been watering, creating the illusion to a little kid that I was actually able to grow plastic flowers.
Wow, that is good Wisconsin parenting right there.
Yes, indeed. And, the connection was so ingrained in my psyche that it took me until well into adulthood to realize, hey, that couldn't possibly have happened. Well, a similar thing happened during our interview with Peter Holsapple today, where I told him I always remembered the day the 5-star review for the dB's first album, stands for Decibels, came out in Rolling Stone magazine, and it was 5 stars. It was the first 5-star review I had ever seen, and it left an incredible impression on me that here's a band that I'd never heard of before, and if you make good music, well, you'll get recognized.
And then Peter said, that never happened.
I know.
And funny enough, even ChatGPT says that album got a 4-star review, not 5.
And he said they never were reviewed in the Rolling Stone. So there's myths going left and right here. And I'm still dumbstruck by that because I swear it happened. I can see it, that 5-star review, as vividly as I'm seeing you on this Zoom-like platform, Riverside, Alex.
But I guess the evidence is saying that couldn't have happened, Alan.
It just goes to show you how your mind can play tricks on you. Like I could swear you said when we started this podcast, we'd have 1,000 times the number of listeners that we do.
I did, but I just didn't tell you when.
Can you give me an effing hint?
Sure. By the time those plastic flowers in your parents' garden sprout up again.
And they will.
Yeah. So while we're waiting for that, let's get to our conversation with Peter Holsapple from the dB's. But first, a short break.
And now a guy who played guitar on REM's hit song, Losing My Religion, which was ranked the 169th greatest song of all time by Rolling Stone magazine, Peter Holsapple.
Peter, I live in Portland, Oregon, and my neighbor here is Patterson Hood from Drive By Truckers.
Ah, yes.
And I asked him about some interactions you guys have had, and he mentioned Big Star and their influence on the dB's. And he said, ask Peter whether you were part of this pilgrimage to Memphis.
Oh, yeah.
Around Big Star. Can you tell us about that, and particularly,
of course,
any Spinal Tap moments that came out of it?
We were crazy about Big Star. We thought that those first 2 records were the best things that we'd heard since the Beatles. They really filled a hole that was distinctly missing in our listening. And Chris Stamey had heard them on one of our local radio stations, WAIR, which was an AM station. And he heard When My Baby's Beside Me. And it just basically turned into one of those situations where it was like, wow, this is why we're doing this, isn't it? Okay, so here's a Spinal Tap-ish moment. So I went off to prep school in 9th grade, for what it's worth. I went to Phillips Exeter Academy, and I got to do some stuff, mainly flunk a bunch of classes because I was a product of public education and did not know how to study. But I did, on a musical level, get to play with a really great guy named Ben Montench, who ended up playing with Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers for years and has played on every reasonably good record that's come out in the last 50 years. So when I got back, my friends, Will Rigby, drummer for the dB's, and Bob Northcott had started a band up, and they said, we wrote these songs, and they were really, really cool. You got to hear them. And they played them for me. And one was called Feel, and one was called In the Street. And I was like, wow, man, Bob, Will, you did a great job. And they were like, ha ha, we didn't write this. Those are Big Star songs. So it was like, okay, I got called on that. But the pilgrimage, as we shall refer to it, which got documented in Oxford American a few years ago also. Mitch Easter, Will Rigby, and I drove from Chapel Hill, where we were all living, and wanted to meet up with Alex because Alex had ostensibly produced a record for me, a single called Big Black Truck.
Listener's note, I don't want to insult the people who know, but just in case you don't, Alex Chilton is the guy behind Big Star. Mitch Easter was in a great band called Let's Active and produced REM's incredibly influential first album, Murmur. And Chris Stamey was Peter's co-lead in the dB's, and the two still write and perform together.
We went up to a studio in Connecticut called Trod Nossel, and we picked up Alex in the morning. Chris arranged all this. Chris Stamey arranged all this. So we went up to Trod Nossel every morning for a week or so, and Alex was kind of hungover for a lot of it and didn't really take an active part in producing it, particularly, I guess. He was there, and we recorded, and then we didn't ever finish it. But we met him, and he was nice. And then the H-Bombs, my band with Mitch, opened for Alex at Max's Kansas City for 2 nights. And that was great. Chris was playing bass with Alex, and so Chris engineered all this stuff, because that's the kind of guy he is. So time passed. At one point, the three of us went to Memphis, and we wanted to see what the deal was there. And so we found out where we thought Chris Bell, who was the other leader of Big Star, was, and he was managing his father's Danvers restaurant. But we went to the restaurant, and he came out, and he was wearing his little bow tie, and he was wearing his apron and his white shirt and stuff. And I think he was kind of charmed at the idea that we had come all this distance to figure something out about this band that didn't exist anymore. So we ended up meeting up with him later on at this place called Bombay Bicycle Club. We asked him what he was listening to, and we were a little disappointed because he was like Fleetwood Mac, which is great stuff, obviously, but it was not what we were expecting. So then he said, well, Alex is recording over at Sam Phillips, so do you want to go over there? And we're like, yeah, we could go there, sure.
That's cool.
And so we went over there, and they were recording Like Flies on Sherbet, which is one of Alex's solo records, and it was a crazy, crazy scene. Dickinson was producing. Richard Roseborough was engineering. They had removed the padding from the recording desk. So it was just like this plywood section with holes in it. And I didn't even know what they were recording at the time, but it was just a nutty situation. It was obvious that Chris Bell was a little uncomfortable there. I don't think that they were hating on each other necessarily, but I don't think they were in touch with each other very much. And Roseborough took me aside and he said, this record is either going to change the face of rock music as we know it, or it's going to be a total failure. I was like, I'm going to remember that. And then Mitch and Will went with Alex over to what was Sun Studios on Union. And that was basically in a shambles at that point. They hadn't done a rehabbing of the place. So that was kind of interesting. They took a panel from the ceiling, and there was an old Corvair stuck in there. And I don't know. So it was an interesting trip,
Wow.
to say the least. And then I moved to Memphis shortly thereafter and worked with Roseborough at Sam Phillips, where we'd seen the Flies on Sherbert thing going on. And we did some stuff. And then after that, I moved to New York and I auditioned for the dB's.
What year is this approximately?
1978.
Oh, wow. Yeah. I chatted with Ken Stringfellow from one of my favorite bands, the Posies. And by the way, Ken will be on some of our quick taps in the future. And anyways, when the Posies were on tour backing up Alex Chilton, they had this big interview with Mojo Magazine, who was going to do a whole feature piece on Big Star, and Alex wouldn't meet with the journalists. He just wouldn't do it. Not his thing, not interested. So Ken ended up talking to the reporters for like 3 hours in the lobby of the hotel, and Alex, I guess, would occasionally pop his head downstairs and wave to them with a big smile and then disappear back up the elevator.
Mm-hmm. That sounds about right. I think that ultimately, and this is a little bit of Monday morning quarterbacking with the deceased, but I think that people like me who were big Star fans were anathema to Alex's existence. Alex was not happy with the situation with Big Star. Understandably, they died at the hands of the distributor. It wasn't because the records were bad at all. It was because people couldn't get them. And, you know, you also have to think about this guy who at the age of 16 was pulled out of school for the #1 record in the country.
Right.
And sent out on tour.
Yeah, and to help bring everyone along with the story, prior to Big Star, Alex Chilton was the singer for the Box Tops. And as you noted, the band's recording of the song The Letter went to #1 on the Billboard charts when Chilton was still a teenager.
That's got to affect somebody.
Yeah.
So by the time people like me came along, I'm sure I just seemed like this babbling sycophant that didn't have anything really to talk with him about except for Big Star. So he wasn't all that interested. He humored me sometimes, but a lot of times I'm sure he wished I would just disappear. And I get it. You know, it's fine. I don't begrudge him that at all. I didn't mean to get under his skin, but I did, I'm sure.
Let me ask you about another songwriter who's well respected, but sort of understated, if that's the right way to put it, that I think you've worked with in some capacity. You know, you and I have met twice before, Peter, back in 92, and it was in the context of me tour managing the Chills.
Okay.
And Martin Phillips. The first time we met was at a party in LA at Gavin McKillop's, the record producer's house. I was there with Pat Magnarella, who managed the Chills and went on to manage Green Day and a bunch of other folks. You were there with Susan Cowsills, who I don't know if she was your girlfriend or your wife at the time.
It's probably my girlfriend.
Yeah. And then another time we met was a few months later, I think when the Chills were actually starting their U.S. tour. I think you came to the show in L.A. And as we were about to head off on that tour, your party words to me were, keep them honest. So I'm curious about, did you and Martin collaborate at all? And if so, tell us something about that.
Sure. Well, I got called in by the label. I'm not sure who at the label decided that I would be the ideal guy for that. I guess it's from my years of working in REM's world. But I met up with Martin and we did some rehearsing of songs. We did a lot of rehearsing of songs. Matter of fact, above the Hollywood Athletic Club at a studio that Dave Allen from the Gang of Four, I think, owned, and the Shriekback guys and stuff like that. But Martin was a fascinating cat in that he really, well, I'm not telling you anything you don't know. Martin has got a lot going on in that brain. He's got a lot going on in that brain. He has journaled for decades. He writes these songs and he knows what he wants to hear on them. And I think that's marvelous. I think people that do that are absolutely unique and fascinating. And I think Martin Phillips is a fascinating songwriter and a fascinating human being. I really like him a lot. We locked horns a bunch of times, and there were some moments where I couldn't deliver what it was that he wanted. That's when I pulled in my friend Lisa Mednick to play keyboards on some of the recording. But I was sort of the featured guy on the Soft Bomb album. And that went anywhere from playing guitars and keyboards and slide guitars and mandolin and, you name it. I played whatever the song required and whatever Gavin thought would be a good thing. And it was a long recording process. But I co-wrote one song with Martin, Big Dark Day. That's what it is. And it was a B-side, I think, from The Male Monster from the Id, or as we used to refer to it, The Male Model from Madrid. And Martin did not appreciate that, but I get it. You know, I will say, though, that I was able to see Martin again a few months ago when he played in Durham, North Carolina, where I live, and they played at Motorco. And they had me sit in on a couple of songs with them, and it was the best time. And it was marvelous to see Martin, and I was so glad that his health was improved. And the Chills members in this iteration are just brilliant. They do those songs so much justice, and he does songs from all the way through the catalog. And so I was thrilled, and it was a pleasure to get to see him again after all these years.
Well, that's great. Those are great stories. Thank you. It sparked a couple of memories. First of all, your friend Lisa Mednick, she and I were roommates on tour.
Okay.
And much to her chagrin, because she went into the tour thinking, as the only woman in the touring party, that she was going to get her own room, and she should have. But right when we were about to leave, Martin pulled Pat Magnarella aside, the manager, and said, I got to have my own room. You know, I really got to have my own room. And they'd already been on tour, I think, in Australia and New Zealand, and they were getting on each other's nerves. And so by the time I inherited them in the United States, he needed some space. So I was the one who had to break the news to Lisa that, hey, you and I are going to be roommates.
That's
and
funny.
Tried to put a good face on it. So there was that. And then the second thing that you mentioned, the lengthy recording process. I think the album, if I'm not mistaken, and you may remember a little better, Peter, but I believe they had a $250,000 budget. And I remember Pat telling me that Martin spent every penny of that. And one of the things he wanted to do was commission Van Dyke Parks to write a string arrangement, which Van Dyke Parks co-wrote Pet Sounds with Brian Wilson, right?
Right.
And Pat said, no, you can't do that. Well, Martin went ahead and did it anyway. And I met Van Dyke Parks at church in Beverly Hills and got to share that story with him, which was kind
Van
of fun.
Dyke actually co-wrote Smile, not Pet Sounds. But I was the person that was able to get in touch with Van Dyke about this for Martin, because Van Dyke had played some keyboards on the fourth dB's record, The Sound of Music.
Cool.
And I had met him when I moved out to LA, and we immediately became friends and stuff. It was neat. I was really glad to be able to do that. And they did the string part in the studio at the basement of the Capitol Towers. I think Sid Page was the concert master for it, from Dan Hicks and the Hot Licks, and also from various, oddly enough, Sly and the Family Stone live performances that I've seen recently. But Sid was amazing. So yeah, I'm really glad that Martin spent all that money, because God knows you couldn't get $250,000 to make a record these days.
So you mentioned REM, and I think that it's very interesting, all your connections to REM throughout the history of your career. Like, you started out in a band, Rittenhouse Square, with Mitch Easter, who produced the first REM album, and then Stipe got you on IRS Records, right?
Well, first thing that happened was that I got a call from REM's manager, who I'd known in Chapel Hill, who was saying, I'm managing this band called REM. And I just happened to see a small piece on them in New York Rocker magazine, which we were sort of intimately connected with in New York. And he said, well, I'm looking for a producer. We want to do some recording. And Mitch had just moved back from New York and had set up a studio in his parents' house in Bellows Creek, North Carolina, right outside of Winston-Salem. I said, well, your guy is Mitch Easter, because he is a tabula rasa. He is a good listener. He will help you get what you're looking for. And if you don't know what you're looking for, he'll help you figure that out. So they went and recorded 3 songs at the drive-in. And then they put out 2 of them on Hibtone Records, a 45 of Radio Free Europe and Sitting Still. Then they got involved with IRS and signed with them, and Mitch and Don Dixon co-produced Murmur and Reckoning, the first 2 records by them.
Right.
So that's sort of how that all fell together. And then as REM was making their way out of being on IRS, And we were trying to figure out what to do with the dB's, having been on a label called Bearsville Records, which you may recall from their illustrious roster. But they were going through all sorts of distribution issues. Like when our record like this came out in 1984, the week that it came out, they lost their Warner Brothers distribution. So our record was not in any stores, even though we were on tour with REM. So we were doing things like signing flats for Planet Waves. You know, what could you do? So, and by the time they got their Warner's distribution back, the damage was done. And then it took us years to get out of the Bearsville contract. So in the meantime, Michael and Peter and Mike and Bill were all talking us up at IRS, and we signed with them. And that was an interesting thing as well. So we did one album for them, and I had to sign away all of my publishing of all of my songs, my entire catalog, so that IRS Records would allow us to release. You know the expression, don't shit where you eat?
Yes.
That's what that is. But it was like, what did we do? You know, I mean, I have only recently in the last year gotten my publishing back.
Wow.
But that's all because of the copyright reversion stuff. So anyway, after the dB's split up on the docks at night, agreeing it was best, if I may quote somebody better than I got a call from the aforementioned manager who said, the band would like you to come out as the extra pair of hands. Would you be willing to do that? So I went on tour with them, and that took up the better part of 1989. And it was great fun, you know, getting to play those wonderful songs. Peter Buck would write a different set list every night. I had the luxury of having somebody setting up a Hammond B3 and keyboards for me and tuning my guitars and changing strings. And it was marvelous. Now, I will also say that I perfected a drinking problem that I had been working on for many years. And that just got worse and worse and worse. So that happened. But, you know, we came to a parting of the ways over a writing credit on a song on the Out of Time record, which is a shame, but it's okay. You know, it's years ago. We're all friends again. I see Mike Mills a lot because he's involved in the Big Star group with Chris. In fact, you were talking about Patterson Hood. The band I'm playing lead guitar for now is called The Paranoid Style, and they're a brilliant, brilliant rock band. And I play lead guitar for once in my life. And they have records out on Bar None Records out of Hoboken, New Jersey. And I'm very proud to have this. This is part of my forward-facing self in an attempt to remain marginally relevant at the age of 68. Now, you had asked me for a Spinal Tap moment, right?
Yeah.
Okay. And I have not seen the movie in many, many years, but I did, knowing full well that you were going to bring this up, I did read the screenplay because I'm just not a visual guy. I don't have time for movies. The last movie I've seen in a theater, it's got to be 5 years ago. I would rather listen to 20 records. So I did read the screenplay, so I know what we're talking about. I will say this, that on a Hootie and the Blowfish tour, and you know that I did actually perform as the extra set of hands for Hootie for approximately 26 years.
Oh, right.
And that was a marvelous opportunity.
Cool.
But at one point, somewhere on one of their last tours in the early aughts, the bus stopped at a gas station along the side of the road. So I got off, went to the bathroom, doing a little shopping, postcards, come out, the bus is gone. Nobody checked to see if everybody was on the bus.
Yeah.
If I had a cell phone, it was in my bunk in the bus. I probably had a wallet with an ID, and I think that they probably had pay phones. And I suspect that's how I was able to get there. I did actually make it in time for the gig.
Excellent.
But that's as close to a Spinal Tap moment, I think, as I've ever had.
Okay. So while you haven't seen the movie This Is Spinal Tap in quite a while, you mentioned reading the screenplay, which, by the way, you're our first guest ever to make that claim. So what's your favorite scene?
Let's see. Obviously, Bobby Fleckman is really marvelous. I really love all of her lines.
And by the way, I will tell you that This Is Spinal Tap 2 is coming this year. Rob Reiner and the crew just did a bunch of the shooting down in New Orleans, and Fran Drescher is coming back as Bobby Fleckman.
Oh, I'm so glad to hear that. I actually met Michael McKean at a Richard Thompson show at the Parish above the House of Blues in New Orleans. And he, out of the blue, mentioned that he was a big dB's fan.
That's cool.
And I thought that was really kind of amazing. Oh, here we go. I know it was. I think my favorite part of Spinal Tap is when they've run into Howard Hesseman and when he's trying to leave, right?
Right.
He's okay, great to see you. Great to see you again, Terry. We'll catch up with you on the road. Cheers. Good old days. Fucking wanker. What a wanker. What a wanker. Total no talent sod. He's got this much talent, this much if he's lucky. People were still booing him when we were on. I love that. I love that. So many good moments in that, but that in particular is the one that comes to mind as my favorite. They were still booing him when we were on.
That's awesome.
Yeah. That whole sequence is amazing. And then that's where they come up with that classic line about, they started then talk about his album cover.
Yeah.
Comparing it to the controversial Spinal Tap album cover and the fine line between stupid and clever.
Yes.
Right.
I often find myself thinking that in everything I do.
Right. Is there a particular Spinal Tap moment from being on tour with REM for a year plus?
Well, yeah, I will say that the very first show that we did on the Green World Tour was in Tokyo. And it was a 2-night thing in Tokyo. And we had hired a B3, as one does. I was very excited to be there because in the lobby of the building, they had those weird Beatles sculptures that were on the Golden Beatles songbook, with the 4 heads and stuff like that. And I was like, this is so exciting. So I was very excited about that. But when it got down to playing the show and sound checking, it became obvious that there was a voltage issue with trying to run a B3. And so every time I would press the notes for a chord, the pitch would just sink.
Oh, boy.
So I was sweating bullets, to say the least. I was like, this is really severely not good. And I was like making plans. I was trying to think breaststroke or Australian crawl to get back to the United States from here. Fortunately, I had a keyboard that had fake B3 sounds in it. And so, songs like Stand, that starts with a B3 sound. So you had to have that in there.
Right.
That's what I used until we could sort of figure it out. And we got the, converters being what they are, they can't always push something as voltage driven as a B3 and a Leslie. But we got that sorted out. And then eventually we got back over to the States and we had the Hammond that belonged to the band. But the first show was a total ball buster.
Yeah.
Isn't that something? I mean, it's not like you wouldn't have been just nervous enough, right? Your first show with REM on a big world tour, but then you have the equipment malfunction. Corin Tucker and Carrie Brownstein from Slater-Kinney were guests of ours on the show. And they told a similar story about getting shocked singing into microphones, typically overseas, right? Where some sort of adapter isn't set up quite right and you inadvertently touch your lips to the microphone. It just like practically blows your head off.
I've died on stage a number of times, but I'd really like to not literally die on stage.
The story that you already told about the dB's and being on Bearsville Records and them losing their distribution the week that your album was coming out. I mean, that is about as Spinal Tap as it gets.
Great. So, yeah.
Is there another story from the dB's you can share that when you think about it, it causes you to chuckle this many years later?
We had a bright, shining moment in Stockholm one time. And it was after the first record had come out, after Stands for Decibels had come out. And it was released over there. And it actually went into the top 10 of the charts, which was totally amazing. So we played at this wonderful small theater called Yoda Leon, which I believe is still around. That's Gotalejon. And then afterward, the record company took us out for supper. And of course, we were all about misbehaving at that point. So we drank and drank and drank, and we stole one of those 3-foot peppermills. I don't know how you get that out of a club. I think we probably stuck it under our coat. I also remember harassing the band that was on stage at the place we ate. And it was this guy, Billy Cross. He was like part of the Bob Dylan, what was that big, messy Rolling Thunder review? I think Billy Cross was part of that. And he was still riding whatever notoriety. And we were just so rude. We were so rude.
That's funny.
I have to say, the dB's were intensely polite and not very demanding, and where a lot of bands trash dressing rooms, we cleaned them up. We did plenty of bad stuff, but you really didn't hear about it. Mostly we were just trying to be nice and trying to figure out why our stuff wasn't on the radio. Our feeling was that our records were quality music that, if played for people in a radio situation or in a live situation, probably more in a radio situation, because we spent a lot of time recording this stuff and making it sound interesting. But if people heard it, they would appreciate it and they would understand it and they would like it and they would buy it.
Right.
Because they were buying all sorts of other stuff that we thought we weren't all that far afield from. But, the biggest problem I think that the dB's had, and may possibly still have, but I think we've gotten around that a little bit as time has passed, is our singing was not always dependable. It was dependably undependable. And so there were shows where it was just hard to listen to. I mean, I've heard live tapes of us in the 80s, in the early 80s, and it was not, I get it now, But I think that Chris and I, in particular, we've done a bunch of duet records over the years. We did one called Mavericks that people love. We did one called Here and Now. We did one a few years ago, acoustic versions of dB's songs called Our Back Pages. And I think what comes of being friends and bandmates for 50 years is that you eventually learn how to sing with each other. And I think it's taken us 50 years, but we can do it now. And that's good. And I think that when we do live shows this fall, which I think is on the books for the dB's, that there will be a marked difference in our ability to sing. And I hope that maybe we'll get it across better that way.
That's so interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, it sounds like that inconsistency that you mentioned, it's like you guys cared and do care vis-a-vis thinking back on the Replacements, for example. They cared about other things, perhaps. The quality of the vocals during live shows was probably never a priority.
We tried to keep ourselves entertained. So we would do a lot of different covers. Everybody's Happy Nowadays by the Buzzcocks. We covered Everlasting Love by Carl Carlton. We even covered All Night Long by Lionel Richie at one point in the later part of the band. When we came up to New York, we had this going for us, which was that we had been playing in bands for years. We had learned how to learn songs. We came from a very, very strong local band scene in which you really needed to know how to play these songs, because your audience, a lot of the cases, were other bands who knew whether you were playing it correctly or not, or if you were just kind of sliding by. And yeah, there's a lot of bands that can slide by and they've got a lot of charisma and they're entertaining because they're shambolic. And do you know the band The Move?
I don't.
Do you know the band Electric Light Orchestra?
Sure.
Okay, before Electric Light Orchestra, there was a group called The Move. And The Move was a band from Birmingham, England. And Bev Bevan, who was the drummer for ELO, was a member. And Roy Wood, who started ELO with Jeff Lynne, was the main songwriter. And they were a 5-piece band, and everybody in the band sang. And everybody in the band sang really well. And so when you go and listen to like their BBC recordings or their live recordings, or you watch any of their shows at the Marquee, sometimes you can find video of them. And it's just astonishing because you learn your parts. You don't steal other people's parts. You learn how to sing it. You learn to feel how it feels when it's correct. So even if you can't hear it, you know that it's correct. I would like to be a better singer that way. So we'll see.
Interesting.
I have just recorded a new solo record. It's going to be called The Face of 68. You were talking about a $250,000 budget. We did this one for $7,200.
Nice.
Cool.
My friend Don Dixon was the producer. The bass player was Robert Sledge, who used to play with the Ben Folds Five. The drummer was Rob Ladd, who now plays with the Connells, but has worked with Alanis Morissette and Don Henley and has done all sorts of incredible stuff. And it's going to come out at the beginning of next year. I'm the lead guitar player of note. I sang everything. I wrote everything. It's 11 great songs. And again, the forward-facing Peter Holsapple, that is me. And that is one of the things I am most excited about, is feeling relevant and
that's so great.
having something new to present. It's a really great record.
And you said that comes out early next year?
Yes,
early
it does.
2025?
Yes. And the dB's stuff, there is an Instagram page and there is a dB's website. For me, I have a blog called Does This Band Make Me Look Fat? And I am a periodic contributor to that, my own blog, when I remember to do it. And I'm trying to be better about that. That's on Blogspot, and you can find me there. And I'm fairly active on Facebook. I take on all comers, and I try to keep it interesting.
All right, Peter. Well, thank you so much. This has been a lot of fun.
Peter, it was really a pleasure. Nice meeting you.
It was nice to meet you, too.
Thank you to the forward-facing Peter Holsapple for sharing stories from his rearview mirror with all of us. And his blog, Does This Band Make Me Look Fat, got me thinking, does this podcast make me sound smart or even funny? I'm not sure I want to hear the answer, but if anyone has an opinion, please DM us on Instagram at TMEPshow or send an email to hello@tmepshow.com. I promise to reply. Thanks also to Wendy Brinford Jones at Hello Wendy PR for helping us to connect with Peter. Too Much Effing Perspective is a Milwaukee Talkies original. Our editor is Gretchen Kilby. Our music composer is J.K. Harrison. Visit our website at tmepshow.com to sign up for our mailing list and find our other episodes featuring rock stars, comedians, and entertainment luminaries whose bizarro stories we enjoy and we think you will too on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen.
Although it would be as great as having armadillos in our trousers, this podcast is not affiliated with This Is Spinal Tap, and no person or entity connected with the film has sponsored or endorsed its content. This podcast is not affiliated, sponsored, or licensed by Authorized Spinal Tap LLC or Century of Progress Productions.
Evergreen Podcast Network.